Let's begin overseas, where Chinese President Xi Jinping is facing major domestic unrest. Thousands of people took to the streets in parts of Beijing, Shanghai, and other major cities over the weekend, calling for Xi to step down and demanding his government lift its harsh zero-COVID policy, which has failed to stop the spread of the virus. Well, today, China recorded more than 40,000 new COVID cases, setting a record for a fifth straight day. Elizabeth Palmer is following the story for us.
A man shouts what, until now, few would even have dared say aloud.
Xi Jinping!
Down with Xi Jinping!
Xi Jinping!
Down with the Communist Party. There were public protests across the country over the weekend in at least 10 cities, including Shanghai. We reached one of the protesters there on Sunday night.
How angry are people with the lockdowns?
Very, because they're very angry. Oh my God. Oh my God.
We agreed to hide her identity, as this interview could get her arrested. Over the weekend, an unknown number of protesters was arrested, including the BBC's cameraman, though he was later released. The protests are by far the biggest challenge yet to Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy, which has battered the economy and locked down hundreds of millions of people.
What do your friends say about the Chinese government's management of COVID?
People do not support it at all.
The anger was actually sparked by a tragedy thousands of miles away in Xinjiang, western China. 10 people burned to death in an apartment fire last week. A furious crowd gathered round the government offices, convinced that COVID restrictions had stopped the fire engines from reaching the blaze. Authorities denied that, but the story was a tipping point. People gathered at vigils in sympathy with the victims, and some held up blank pieces of paper to symbolize the way critical voices in China are silenced. By Sunday night, this largely peaceful but utterly unprecedented dissent had spread even to the capital, Beijing. Now everyone is wondering how the government will react. But Xi Jinping's commitment to mass testing, lockdowns, and vast warehouses for isolating COVID contacts is core policy. And the sight of citizens chanting, "Lift lockdowns," isn't likely to change his mind.
All right, for more on the unrest unfolding in China, let's bring in Dan Mattingly. He's an assistant professor of political science at Yale University. So, Dan, I guess the question is, how unusual are these types of protests in China? And is this, it strikes me, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that this is, supposedly the reason why people are in the streets is to protest the COVID restrictions. But it feels bigger than that. It feels as if this is sort of a tipping point, not suggesting that Xi Jinping is going anywhere and that they're going to roll back these restrictions, but it feels like this is an excuse, for lack of a better word, to go out into the streets and protest the Communist Party in China.
Well, I think what we're seeing today is extraordinary, and what we've seen over the weekend. First you have nationwide protests scattered across a bunch of different cities across China, which really isn't something that we've seen since 1989 at this level. And second, as you mentioned, some of these protesters are angry over the zero COVID restrictions and angry over the tragedy in Urumqi. And they're calling for changes to policy. And you have even some protesters calling for political change. So these are two remarkable things that I think we haven't seen at scale in China over the last 30 years, really, since 1989.
And it's, no small detail. You mentioned 1989, the Tiananmen Square incident. To this day, that is something censored across China anytime it's mentioned or reported. These issues of unrest as well aren't being communicated internally. What then do you think happens next? I mean, for folks here in the States who are mad about wearing a mask on a plane, the irritation a lot of Chinese people feel is that times 10, times 100, when you consider some folks have been locked inside their homes. Remind us what sparked this, and where do you think it goes from here?
Well, what we've seen over the last couple of years is a remarkable reversal, where the zero COVID policy was, for a time, a big success in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party because China was able to prevent the spread of COVID for years. Now it's become a sort of millstone around the neck of Xi Jinping, and it's not clear, first, if he can open up rapidly given the problems that would create with the Chinese health system. And second, if he responds to these protests by immediately opening up, that creates a political problem for him where it could spur more protests as people see protests essentially succeeding in pushing policy change. So he's in a sort of bind. And so I think that what's probably going to happen is what we started to see over the weekend, where you see a sort of tightening repression and a crackdown on these protests. And the big question is, how long will these protests be sustained? In 1989, the protests were sustained across dozens of cities for almost 2 months. And so we'll see where this goes.
Wow.
So we've been saying this all along. Some of the protesters are calling for President Xi himself to step down. You mentioned 1989. I mean, it feels as if that we in the media report on these as we should, but that nothing ever really changes. We saw something similar happen in Hong Kong. The Chinese are still fully in control of Hong Kong. So do these protests at all threaten President Xi's government in any way?
Not now. I think that you need to see at least two things happen for these protests to threaten the government. First, you need to see sustained protests over a number of weeks. And second, and maybe most important, you need to see a real significant split in the party elite at the very top level. And that's really what drove the 1989 protests, was a sense that there was real disagreement at the top about policy choices. And if you took to the streets, you'd be supporting a member of the political elite who's pushing for political change. So I think unless we see a split at the very top level of the party, and it's unlikely to lead to meaningful political change. Xi Jinping right now is pretty secure.
Well, that's what I was going to say. If anything, we've seen President Xi consolidate power and really secure his position. Dan Mattingly, great to chat with you about this. We appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks so much.